Hello, everybody. Welcome to this video today in week 3 about the short story Tender by Cherline Bazile. And today we're going to be talking about characterization techniques in the story. We're going to continue our discussion of characterization this week, everyone. You're going to participate in a discussion board. And this week, I decided to push the reading journal number 2 to next week because this week we're going to engage in a little bit of a creative activity. I want you to rewrite a short scene from the story to be able to understand a little bit more about characterization techniques. So in this video, everybody, just like last week with aliens, I want to take the very boring text that I give you on Blackboard, and make it come to life a little bit more so we can understand a little more about characterization. So today, once again, we'll talk about some of the techniques that Cherline Bazile uses in the story to portray her characters. Now, I want to start just with a little bit of a look back into last week. You notice that in the first story, Aliens, the characterization techniques to portray the character of Jimmy are fairly easy um, to pick out and examine and see how the character of Jimmy develops. In other words, as we talked about last week, we see character techniques used in Alien that directly relate to how well we know Jimmy. In the beginning, it's just direct description given by a first person narrator. So when you think about that, a first person narrator is someone telling you about someone else. Is that always the most reliable information? Not really. So in Aliens, it starts with this unreliable information and starts to become more reliable. We start to see Jimmy through actions and dialogue, and this is some of the more reliable ways to get to know a character. In the story Tender this week, it's a little bit different. The characterization techniques used in this story are a little broader, and they're not used in such a way that you immediately get a good understanding of the characters. It's a first person narration, once again, but the first person narration, the person telling the story, is one of the main characters in the story. So this puts a different spin on the way that we discuss characterization. Think about it this way, everybody, just quickly as an experiment. How do you know what you know? Okay. So, for example, everyone, imagine you want to know about how it hurts to stub your toe. So, you imagine that question, how it hurts to stub your toe. So, you stub it yourself, you knock your foot against a table. That's one way of knowing direct information. What about watching someone else stub their toe? What about hearing the story about someone who stubbed their toe? What about hearing someone tell a story about someone who stubbed their toe and that person telling the story wasn't in the room? You see what I mean, guys? This idea of knowing what we know, it applies to the real world, how well we know that information. Obviously, stubbing your toe is the best way to know how much it hurts. It also applies to the way we read stories. How can we rely on the information that we get? And this is one of the first stories we're going to encounter this kind of logic. Because once again, the main character is a character in the story. So let's see how that kind of applies a little bit, guys. So characterization techniques used in Tender, we're going to look at, just like last week, there's a few this week that might be a little bit new, okay? But mostly in this story, we're going to talk about dialogue, thoughts of the characters. Relationships, of course, are a big one in this because it's mostly about two friends. And actions. Remember, actions, what characters do, everyone. This is some of the most effective ways to understand how characters operate. Okay, so by the end of this week, we want to describe how the author reveals Eden and Fatima. Okay, remember, that's what we're doing in this class. We don't want to talk about what characters are like they're walking around the halls of Seneca. You are studying a text. So we want to be able to always talk about how authors presented characters. This is literary analysis. We're not talking about Eden and Fatima just like they're our best friends. We want to talk about what authors did to portray these characters this week. Okay. So regarding this, everybody, I'm going to start off with speech first. Okay. Once again, these videos will be about 10 minutes or so. I'm going to post a couple on Tender this week, guys. If you have any suggestions about the videos, please mention them in any sort of comments. Um, okay, so anyway, speech, guys. Think about first what this characters say in the story. Okay. In the beginning of the story, early when we see the first scene in the car, Eden says to Fatima, or Fatima says to Eden, "I wish I liked you more." Okay. Now, this phrase here, imagine you heard this from a friend. All right. Well, there's a lot of circumstances where you would say this. There's a lot of circumstances that a friend, especially if they knew you well, might use this. But this shows Fatima to be someone who is blunt, emotionally distant, perhaps, okay, and comfortable asserting power in the relationship. This is who Fatima is. We see it in the very first beginning of the story. We also see that Eden is someone who hesitates. She softens, over explains. She's the tender one. Okay, so for example, when she says something in the early parts, we're talking about David, oh, we went on a date, date-ish, maybe a half date. She keeps qualifying it in these ways to please the thoughts of her friend. So right from the beginning, we see that what the characters say says a lot about the character they are. Okay. As a matter of fact, just before we move on, everyone, doesn't entirely relate to speech, but the first scene in the story is particularly important to understand the characters themselves. Because you notice that as a reader, you're drawn in by this character, Eden, complaining about certain things. You're drawn in by her victimhood at a friend who treats her terribly. She's going to be late coming home to her mother. But when you look at that scene, you notice the things that are really bothering Eden are just the things around her, the lights on the dashboard, the heat in the car, just, the fact that her mother, she's thinking about how she's going to be angry, not finishing the braids. These are things that have an external effect on who she is. Okay, so it's not really Fatima that's doing this to her. If you imagine the scene itself, it's more Eden and her own insensibility or her own vulnerabilities that come through. So the first way that we see the story presented to us is through speech, and it shows Eden to be someone who's insecure, needs approval, okay, and Fatima is someone who's blunt, emotionally distant, and feeling comfortable being in control in the late relationships. So it shows speech as this confidence versus vulnerability dynamic. Okay. Continuing on, everybody. Got to get through this. So, the thoughts of the characters. This is an especially important part of the story, especially when we see this through Eden's eyes. Now, with thoughts in this story, everybody, think about the ways that we have direct access to characters like Eden. We have direct access to her thoughts. But on the other side, we don't have access to Fatima's thoughts. And this is part of the reason I want you to write the creative activity this week to rewrite a scene. You're going to imagine a scene from Fatima's perspective. But if you imagine the thoughts from Eden's perspective, for example, there's the one scene where Fatima says that white girls are easier. Okay. And Eden thinks in this scene that it must mean then you, meaning her, of course. But is that what Fatima actually says? She never says that. She never actually says that. So once again, this is interpretation, projection. This is the character of Eden who is trying to couch her own emotions in the tenderness she feels. Once again, remember, the story is called Tender. And so think about how that applies to the main character, Eden, throughout. And this is a good example of it. She's always taking something as some sort of an injury to her own emotional well-being. And this is something that makes her feel better about herself in ways. She's always the victim in certain situations. Excellent, guys. Continuing on. Relationships in the stories, effects on others. Okay. Characters and stories influence each other. This is the way that characters are developed by interactions in the story. If someone treats somebody a certain way and treats somebody else differently, this says something about the character. If we see consistent interactions between characters, it says something about them. And in this story, the relationships, specifically between Fatima and Eden, is essential to understanding the characters themselves. Okay, so for example, with Eden and Fatima, Eden is deeply affected by Fatima. She obsesses over her approval. Her mood depends on how Fatima treats her. Okay, but Fatima experiences Eden a little differently. Okay, so for example, in the subway conversation towards the end of the story, Fatima says directly to Eden, "You want so badly for me to be perfect." Think about what this means, everyone. Okay, it says a lot about the two characters in the story if you focus on this subway scene. Fatima feels pressured in a certain way. And she sees Eden as a character, a friend who is emotionally demanding because Eden is someone who always wants a foil in her own understanding of her own relationships and character. She wants someone who is somehow getting what they want to make her own situation of being denied things more real. Okay. There's a lot of deeper issues in this story, guys, that we're going to get into. All right. Next, everyone, actions. This is once again, okay, the most effective way to understand a character in a story. If a character does something, you trust that to say something about them. So, for example, you look at the hair braiding scene, guys. Okay, it's a great story, a great part of the story. It's intimate, painful. It represents control in a way, but it's also something where Fatima's not necessarily doing it on purpose. Okay, it hurts Eden at times, and she still continues to do it. And then Eden later on, she cuts those braids out, throws them away. Okay. And in this moment, it shows that she has this desire simply for independence in a small way. It shifts her identity a little bit. Okay. Actions reveal what characters can say out loud, everybody. All right. So follow the actions in the story to understand more about the characters. Finally, guys, setting is something that we're specifically going to talk about even after the study break, not for a few weeks. But setting is a fairly simple way of understanding characterization. Because setting, what the author describes around a character, it mirrors their emotional state. So you think about the first scene in the story, for example, the green numbers on the dashboard. This is a setting that's reflecting the character of Eden at that moment. She feels very pinned in, very tense, very and full of angst. And that number on the dashboard reflects that emotional capacity. Towards the end of the story, we see other ways of describing this. For example, at the ice rink, Fatima is very comfortable on her skates, whereas Eden seems to be, uh, you know, falling and having a lot of difficulty. This sort of represents their emotional state. Fatima is a very confident, stable person, whereas Eden is someone who is sort of emotionally clumsy and falls occasionally and needs a little bit of help from time to time. So this is an example of how setting reflects that element of characterization. Okay, everybody, excellent. So we're going to end the video there. In this video, everybody, remember, we're looking at characterization techniques of the author, and specifically dialogue, thoughts, relationships, actions, and setting. So this week, everyone, study the story for these techniques, jump in the discussion board and tell us what you think. I'm going to post another video by Thursday to give a few more insightful, inspiring thoughts. So thank you, everyone. I'll see you in the discussion forum and have yourself a great week.